Hello boys and girls, we're back with another exciting episode or series of debates and this time we're going to look at more debates about debates, continuing from the theme that we took last month. Although some of you are going to say like, look at these debates and go like, what? Because we're going to look at a few more intense, a little bit more out there, maybe even crazy debates, right? But these debates are important because one, they come up in tournaments, and if they come up in tournaments, you must know how to cope with them. And two, I think they do help you develop your debate ability. If you only can debate certain types of debates, then you're not a very good debater now, are you? Right? No. Yes. No, you're not. So we need to be able to be diverse and flexible and learn to debate different types of debates. Even if you look at that and go like, I don't understand the point of debating this. A good debater will try to find a way to debate it, and within that effort, that process, you develop a new skill. You become more flexible. Okay, so we're going to start with something not so out there, and this is a very common debate. It's a debate about saving lives now versus helping lives in the long term. Looks surprising, shocking? Well, don't be. I'm sure you've debated this type of debate before. You're usually presented with a solution. You do something pretty drastic, right? And that doing something drastic will involve this trade-off. I need to solve this problem. I need to save people who are dying now, who are in some kind of extreme crisis. But in order to do that, I need to do something controversial that may, in the long term, reduce the chances of those people surviving, or in the long term, cause some kind of extreme harm. Right? So that's the trade-off. What do? Do you help people now in the short term, save these lives, but sacrifice possible or potential gains in the long term? Or maybe even sacrifice potential people in the long term, right? So that's the debate. Let's explore. So as I explained earlier a little bit, a big part of this debate is the problem. Right? It's a core part of the debate. On the affirmative side, you're going to build this problem up as much as possible. You're going to increase the urgency to act, why it is immediate, right? It's a crisis, pretty much. And if you don't act, right, it's critical. Hundreds of thousands of people will die, right? Weakest of them, children, will die, and it's terrible. So what you're trying to do here is you're trying to, one, make sure the necessity of your action, make it incredibly critical that we do something now, right? But you're also trying to overwhelm the solution or the controversy of the solution, okay? Because you want to get to a point where you can say that, yeah, maybe we have to give up some of these things, but look, if we don't act now, then all of these harms, this evident harms, and we don't have an option basically to act now. We need to take on this solution, even if it may be a little bit controversial, right? So that's your strategy. That's your approach in this type of debate. But if you do this, you must also show that your solution will solve this problem, right? So sometimes teams build like a huge problem, make it life-threatening. Every person on the planet is going to be affected by this. But the solution isn't very that drastic. They tone down the solution and pare it out and say we'll only do X, Y, and Z because you don't want to accept the controversy that comes with the solution. This is going to mean that you will end up having a problem-solution mismatch. Okay? Don't do that. Embrace the controversy. So even though it's controversial, we need to do it because we have a huge problem and tie the problem in as closely as possible to the solution. So you can't change the solution very much. You can't tear the solution apart and pare it down and remove X, Y, and Z, right? So the solution says abolish patents, which is one thing we're going to look at. You can't say abolish patents for only these very few things and abolish them for a short period of time, abolish them but still allow people to gain some money and pay and require. That's not really abolishing them. Okay, so you can't, that will be a squirrel and you won't also be really solving the problem. What you can do though is you can characterize the problem to fit the solution, right? You can focus on details of the problem, pick parts of the problem which you feel are crucial and need to be addressed now, and through that you can say that the solution will fit. Okay, so I think that's the better approach. What do you do on the opposition side? On the opposition side, you need to take a position on the problem, right? So you need to say whether you think the problem is serious, not serious, right? Don't just ignore and say it's not a problem, right? But you can talk about how the problem is, you want to lower the intensity. Maybe it's improving, right? Maybe it's not super critical, okay? That there are trends in the status quo that are leading towards improvement of the problem. There are other actors that have stepped in. There are alternatives, perhaps. Okay, so you can provide alternatives, but your alternatives need to take a long-term view, right? Because on the op, it is immediate. It is short-term. Sorry, on the prop, on the affirmative, you need to act now, right? The affirmative is all about being immediate. So on the op, you take a long-term view. That's the contrasting paradigm. On the op, you may be willing to accept some short-term sacrifices, right? Of course, you're going to say, one, that the sacrifices aren't as extreme as the affirmative make them out to be. And also, you're going to say that these solutions don't really solve the problem, right? The solutions maybe make the problem worse. Or seem like they're helping, but they don't actually help. The solution has to be in the long term. In the long term, it is sustainable. In the long term, it will solve the root of the problem, etc., 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 right? So that's the basic kind of split in debate. In the Gov side, you say there is a huge urgency. We need to act now. We need to be immediate. If we don't act now, then there's no point saving things for the long term. All these people are going to die, right? And you show how not acting now will also still impact things in the long term. That will be the clincher if you can do that on Gov. If you can't do that, you just prioritize the short term. And you talk about how it devalues long-term benefits if we don't save these lives in the short term. Okay? On the op, you say that it's tough. It's not maybe as tough as the Gov is making out to be, but yes, it is tough. And that's why we're going to try to find solutions. We need to change our approach. We need to do many things, but we have to think of sustainable, real solutions, right? Not just band-aids. We can't just keep putting band-aids because we're not really making the patient healthier. And we need to make the patient healthier. And putting band-aids doesn't help make the patient healthier, right? So you have to show that what is happening right now, these short-term solutions are counterproductive to the long-term change, right? Because the app will probably try to take both. Okay, so you say a neg, you can't take both. Okay, so that's the basic kind of split in this debate. How do you whether to do stuff in the short term or long term, right? Save lives now, act short term, or help lives in the long term. Let's look at a few motions. Oh, well, before that, this is my how to debate every debate like this box. Let's get into a little bit more detail, right? So that's a bit of a summary. In the approach on the Gov side, problem is critical, must act now. Immediate solutions cannot wait, right? Because remember, if people buy the idea that you need to act now, then the short-term paradigm will win, okay? And show how acting now helps people in the short term and in the long term. Then you get the short-term paradigm, right? In neg, do the opposite. Yes, big problem, but doing this will be problematic and harmful in the long term. There are other solutions better in the long term. Okay, so show how there are other ways we can solve this problem. If you do this now, it's going to create harm again in the long term, and harm again and harm again. So in the end, more people will end up suffering, more people will die. Right? That's a good way for you to try to get into that moral calculus a little bit. Some possible arguments, the reason why we need to act now, contrasting this with the long-term gains, right? And you can show how also attack the long-term part. So just the way negative side is going to attack affirmative solution and say that that doesn't really work. Affirmative can do the same thing for negative, right? Affirmative can say that this long-term thing doesn't really work. This waiting for a long term, that's part of the problem. You need to solve these things now. right? Or this long-term approach doesn't really make any sense. It's just it's part of the problem, maybe, that we're waiting for these long-term changes, right? On op, you argue that there are other solutions that are better, that saving people now is useless if they suffer again in the long term, right? And this is you trying to take the moral high ground back. So we also care about people, more people will suffer, blah, blah, blah. And then here you attack their proposal, right? Talk about the deeper problems, whatever the deeper problems are. And you can use the deeper problems voice if you have the deeper problem voice. The clash in this debate, short-term versus long-term, right? How should government prioritize these things? This is strongly connected to the effectiveness of whether the solution will work or whether the solution will not work. A lot of this is going to come down to what exactly is the real problem, right? What is the real cause or the real problem? The side that will identify the real problem that best suits their approach, obviously, will win. Let's look at some examples, because there's nothing like examples. Well, there are many things like examples, but which are, examples like examples. But you know what I mean. If you don't know what I mean, then just not pretend and work with me. Help me to help you. Okay, motion number 1. This House will abolish patents on life-saving drugs. So patents here are the right of companies to control the sale of drugs that they develop. It applies to more than just drugs, right? So if you develop something new, a new way of doing things, a new process, right, a clear leap from how things were done before, you have the right to patent that idea, even before you bring that idea to market. Most patents last for about 20 years. So I can patent something, great idea, then I work on it. No one else can work on it because I patented it. Then I have the exclusive rights to sell it, right? I have a monopoly over it until the patent expires, and then other people and everybody can sell it and merchandise it, okay? So the idea behind patents is it encourages people to invest and to innovate, and it gives due recognition and reward for people's ideas. These are will be neg arguments. So if I develop a new idea, then I have the right over it because it's my idea, right? It also encourages me to invest in that idea. So especially when it comes to drugs, it takes a long time, a lot of resources, hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars, lots of time to create new drugs and to test them. And you're not sure if those things are going to be successful anyway at the point in which you develop them, right? So there's a lot of risk that drug companies take. And they need these patents in order to encourage them to take the risk and also recoup their investment, right? That's the justification behind patents, and I've pretty much given you the negative case. But the idea here is that a lot of people say, fact is that many people can't afford to buy drugs, right? They don't have the money. That's terrible writing. I'm going to do it again. To buy drugs to save their lives, okay? So this was a big issue a few years ago, but still is now with HIV or AIDS drugs, right? So if you get HIV, AIDS in the first world, if you can afford to buy these drugs, it's not a terminal illness as much as it used to be. You can still live with HIV, AIDS, but in the third world, or if you can't afford to buy those drugs, i.e. you are poor, it is a death sentence, you will die. Right? Many diseases that are terminal or require very, very expensive treatments, and drug companies charge a lot. In your packet, you will get lots of examples about drugs that can cost hundreds of dollars a day in order to just survive, or thousands of dollars a day and add up to 20, 30, 40, 50, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to survive. Not to get cured, right? To survive, to ensure that you don't die. So that's the problem, right? The people can't afford the drugs. People are dying, right? We need these drugs. Okay, so that's the problem as developed by Gov. Now, the Gov can argue for just a flat-out banning, of these drugs. And in terms of not banning the drugs, abolishing the patent. In terms of the model, you can abolish the patent or allow countries that have an emergency situation to abolish the patent. Now, the World Trade Organization and TRIPS, the Trade Later Intellectual Property Rights Agreements, does allow countries that have national emergencies to void patents, but that means countries have to declare epidemics. And countries don't want to say that my country is in an epidemic situation, because that means the whole country is kind of dying, which isn't really true, but also discourages investors. Also, you can have an epidemic in a certain section, right, or situation, but not overall. Like, it's impossible to get cancer drugs, to afford to buy the cancer drugs. It doesn't mean there's a cancer epidemic, but I will never be able to get those cancer drugs, right? So you can say poor countries should be allowed to do this. Maybe it doesn't happen all across the world, but in those poor countries, they can do it, right? Or you can propose a different model, which is prizes instead of patents. There's a detailed explanation in the packet, and you can Google this, but it's basically the idea that instead of giving people separate a patent and the right to control the product, you give them a big prize. Right, so the company that develops this drug gets a huge prize, $3 billion maybe, and in return for that prize, patents are free. Everybody there's no patent, so everyone can get the drugs, right? So that way the company gets the reward, and everybody gets the product. So some people do develop things like this, especially when it comes to technology, like NASA and the American government has a long-standing prize for people, many different types of prizes, for people who can do exceptional, to make breakthroughs in space travel, for example, to solve certain mathematical equations, right? You can claim this prize, right? So instead of saying you should be the only one who can use it, it encourages many different people to try, and then when they can try, and whoever wins gets that prize, okay? But anyway, I'm digressing a little bit, right? But it applies, the type of solution you use will try to address different aspects of the problem. Offering a prize means that people will still get incentive to develop stuff, but it may not deal with drugs that are already in the market. If you just want to focus on solving the problem, millions of people around the world, right? Africa, Asia, can't afford these drugs, else they will die. These drugs already exist. Companies want to charge so much money for these drugs. We're going to say that abolish the patents on those drugs because we need to save lives. That is the most direct approach. Okay? So build up the problem, show effectiveness, right? To save lives of people, argue humanity, morality, right? These are consistent arguments arguments you consistently make whenever you talk about saving lives. If you want to carry into the long-term thing, you can say that in the long term, these countries need people, right? And without the people, without this valuable human resource, they're dying. So you can't really develop stuff in the long term if they're going to lose all these people, right? On opposition, you talk about the value of patents. Okay, so this is you defending the stuff in the long term, right? So the value of patents need to recognize and to reward innovation, right? If we don't reward innovation, then in the long term, no more drugs, right? And you say that's super, super important. So we deal with the problems now, but we don't deal with the problems in the future. Also, you say that no more drugs to deal with types of illnesses, because illnesses evolves, right? So you have SARS, then SARS-1, SARS-2, SARS-3. Now you have MERS, you have all of these different things. Even things like HIV have different strains. So it doesn't mean that the drugs may work the same way. The people need to be invested in these drugs. The companies need to be willing to change and adapt them in order to help people, right? If they don't, it's not going to work, okay? So this is you trying to make the long term. And you show that maybe drugs can save some people, but that's not going to solve the whole thing. Because of these different types, won't solve all or every aspect of the problem. All problem. Okay, well, the whole problem. But having the drugs itself is not enough. You need public health infrastructure. You need to make sure people are properly and early and diagnosed at the appropriate time. You need to make sure people take their drugs at the same time. All of these things. So you're not saying the drugs will never work, but you're saying the drug is not a magic pill. Magic pill, right? So it's not that I give one pill to this person and then they're cured forever, right? You need to make sure that people are diagnosed early. You need to make sure they take the drugs early. Maybe different people need different combinations of drugs. And if countries are very poor, they don't have the infrastructure. So what countries need is more help. They need more money, right? They need the support of these drug companies. So on op, you say like, yeah, maybe we can bring down the prices. Okay, but we can't abolish the patents, right? We need to bring more help from the first world to subsidize. We need more like funds, right? And then we need more comprehensive solutions, not just abolishing patents, okay? So that's enough for the first motion. Let's look at the second one. Let's move up here. So this house believes that countries with food shortages should not invest in biotechnology. So you should be thinking about this and try to apply the frame that we just discussed. Pause the video. Think about how you will characterize the problem. What is the trade-off here? Why biotechnology? And how to make that problem really specific. And then explore some arguments on GAF and on OP. And you're thinking, you're doing it, and we're back. Okay, so what did you discover? Absolutely correct, I think. The tension here is using food for biotech, right? And I'll send you a debate that I did on this issue, so you can compare and see what happened there. So the trade-off here is whether or not things that can be used for food should be used for biotechnology. Now, what is biotechnology? It is here biofuels. It's using food to generate fuel, right? So this is like bioethanol, right, etc. And this fuel can be used for commercial use or consumer use, I mean, driving cars and so on and so forth, or heating your homes, or for agricultural use, like to power tractors, or for industrial use, right, or, to run power plants, etc., etc. And it's especially important because the impact on the environment is much less from biofuels. And it's a source of fuel for countries that don't have fuel or can't afford to buy fuel, right? And if countries can't buy fuel, you can't buy oil, you don't have oil, it's very difficult for you to do many, many things, okay? But the trade-off is, should then countries be using things that they can use as food to create this fuel, especially given there's a food shortage, or in some places there are food shortages. Right? There are famines, people can't get access to food, people starving every day. Instead of giving the food to them to eat, so they can use it for their own internal fuel, you're converting it into petrol, ethanol, to put into cars. It doesn't seem like it makes sense. At least that's the trade-off, right? So that's the argument that you make from the Gulf side. Okay, the problem is that people are dying from a lack of food, right? And countries that do produce food are shifting because they make more money, right? Countries make more money because they can sell the stuff to power cars, and it's on the same price as oil now, or at least people will be willing to pay that much more for this. There are also lots of subsidies. So countries that don't want to be dependent on fuel, on petrol, on natural gas, and so on and so forth, they want to encourage development of this. America has a lot of quite controversial ethanol subsidies that made a lot of corn farmers switch into using their production to produce ethanol. Okay, so there's this whole debate around there is about using things that could otherwise be used as food. That's food and fuel. Food, all right, to create fuel. Fantastic. Okay, so that's the first thing. Develop that problem. So the problem here isn't so much, the problem of people starving isn't that food has been switched into bioethanol, But you're arguing that this will make the problem worse, okay, because it makes food more expensive, and especially if the context here is that countries with a food shortage, countries that are poorer, countries that are developing, right, they shouldn't be investing or moving into this technology. And those countries need to develop their resources, spend their energy on creating sustainable, dependable food supplies, right? So again, you argue that, this is the more moral thing to do. Why this is the role of government to take care of their people. And you also argue that in the long term, they can't develop without human resources and talent, and without the kind of sustainable food supply, right? And for that, they need to ensure that they do all of these things first. So they can't look past the food shortage. On op, you say that development is the most important, right? So maybe there's a food shortage now. Maybe, okay, all right. There is a food shortage, but that isn't just about produce. You solve it not just by creating more food. Okay. So for example, it's also about transferring the food and storing food, and making sure that people can get access to that food, right? Like a lot of food in India and rice grain, and there's a lot of starvation and poverty, ends up getting spoiled in granaries, in places that are storing the food. Right? Because you need to transfer them from the farmers to the people who are receiving them. Maybe it's about efficiency, logistics, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so now that won't solve the entire problem, granted, but again, you're doing that to weaken the solution. Okay, so you say that's about weakening the solution, and you say more of this food wastage happens in the first world than in the third world. What the third world need to do, what these countries that are struggling need to do, is they need to develop, right? And in order to develop, they need fuel, they need to create new industries, they need to sell this stuff. If they can sell this stuff, then their people will be able to buy food from other places, they'll be able to import food, they'll be able to do all kinds of fantastic things, because now they are developed or developing, or in the process to that, right? So you take the long-term, more sustainable approach. You say that just because they make food now, they transfer everything, doesn't mean that they're going to be able to do that. You talk about in the long term, technology will develop, right? The real future with biotech is converting waste. If people can convert food waste into fuel, then nothing is wasted. Unfortunately, you need things with high sugars to convert that into fuel, into alcohol, ethanol, right? So if you don't have high sugars, meaning like you need the corn, the actual corn, not the stalk, not the stuff that you throw away, because there isn't really any sugars in that, right? But that's the trade-off in the debate. On the Gov side, you're going to say we need to help people right now. And if you don't help people now, there's no people in the long term, or you're not going to get that kind of long-term development. On the op side, you say that you need to start thinking long-term. These drastic proposals are going to perpetuate the poverty, right? Last look. The global community should provide humanitarian aid to North Korea. Again, think about the motion, pause, make arguments, etc., etc. And then we're back. Good. So this debate is about whether you're going to help things in the short term or the long term. Okay? So problem, people starving. Right? So there's a short term, long term problem. I didn't mean to say it in that kind of happy tone, right? It just came out. It's a terrible thing that people are. In the short term, it's horrendous that people are starving and left, and there's no way to create change. And yes, a lot of these things are because of the regime, right? Also could be because of regime external things like drought and famine, but there's no way you're going to argue that the regime are helpful, charming, compassionate individuals. They're just not, okay? But so we need these people had nothing to do with the problem. They are not responsible entirely for their regime. They need help. So they need aid. They need food. They need medicine. Right? They need all of these things. So it is about short-term humanitarian development aid. And you say that when they get this aid, you try to connect it to the long term. Right? So they may lead to revolution. They may lose respect or dependence from the government, right? Not getting this aid because the crisis will be blamed on the evil American empire anyway. So that's not going to come across. It's better if through aid we can lead to some kind of engagement. Maybe when they see these strange medicines, they see things that, you know, they've never eaten before in their life. It's got to be coming from somewhere else, even if the packaging has been changed. Something, all of those things maybe will lead to solving the long-term problem, but in the short-term problem, you keep people alive while and you don't have to show that giving aid solves the long-term problem, but it keeps people alive while we work on other long-term solutions, right? So long-term solutions must be diplomatic. Okay? Now on op, what do? You have to be a little bit more hardcore on op. You say like, yes, people are dying, the regime's horrendous, but one, giving them this aid doesn't mean the aid will actually help people. Where will it go? Aid goes to soldiers. Aid goes to Kim Jong-un's home, right? Aid goes to all the people with power, right? Because you have to use the government. The government's not going to let aid agencies work on the ground. That's just the reality. And if you make that a condition on Gov, the debate's not going to work, right? Because that's not going to happen. That is a condition giving aid on the government becoming transparent and changing. Government isn't transparent. You have to give aid through the government. That will end up being a contention debate. But if that is, then I think OP will win that, showing that the government will only accept aid through the government because that's how they've always done it, right? So on OP, you show that, hold on, the aid isn't going to help. You know, most of it, a vast majority of this aid is going to go to military and politically connected sources. Okay. Secondly, you say that, look, even if some of this aid reaches the people, they're not going to know it's from the outside world. It's going to be like repackaged under Korean packaging and North Korean packaging and all those things, and nobody will know. And the government will use it to increase their own propaganda and their own strength, right? And then what they will do, they'll arrest people, they'll torture them, they'll do all this other stuff, right? So you try to take the moral high ground back by showing worse suffering for people in the long term, right? So either more starvation, give myself more space, or torture, right? Politically related suffering. So the only thing you can do is remove the government, and this is where you have to like bite the bullet a little bit and say that you need to put pressure on the government, then they have to lose support of the people, right? And that is to make the crisis apparent. How do you make the crisis apparent? Don't give them aid. Force them. So two things here. One is it gives you a bargaining chip with negotiations. So give aid if they agree to do things. If they allow the aid to come in and be given, directly along with like a book about how bad government is, maybe, or just no book, but just engage with people, make sure the aid reaches people, I don't know, some kind of conditions that mean that the North have to open up, then maybe, maybe that may not be an entirely bad idea, right, to do it that way. And even if, they don't do that, they're not going to do that, then it puts more pressure on them, right? And it's not just the people, everyday people. Soldiers are part of the everyday people, right? Soldiers have family and soldiers have other people. And if they lose support from the military, then you get a kind of internal rebellion. And many people say this is the most likely route to change. It's not going to be thousands of peasants rising up, especially if they're all starving and dying. But it may be the people within the government themselves who are not in the upper echelons of society, or who are in the upper echelons and view everything else and don't want to be part of the problem, or people who are in the middle or at the bottom who themselves are also suffering, right, who don't get this handouts from the international community, and they will put pressure to change or to open up. Okay, so that's your theory of change on the long term. On Gov, you say like, yeah, maybe that's going to work, but we tried pressuring and negotiating and nothing happens. Yet in the meantime, people keep dying. right? So we need to appeal to humanity. We need to have the political discussions, but we can't let people die. What do you do? What do you do? I don't know, but you have to think about it and you have to debate it, right? So that's the framework for today. Problems in the short term, doing something controversial, need to solve it now, right? Otherwise, huge loss, people die, highly immoral, and will create problems in the long term. Or in the op, you say like, that's only going to perpetuate the problem. That doesn't really solve the problem, you know. But what does solve the problem is staying the course, doing the long-term thing, taking the long-term approach. That's what we need to do. We need to take the long-term approach. And will create more help. Otherwise, the suffering will just continue. Okay? Now, the suffering from bad debating will just continue unless you make some fundamental changes. And part of that is looking at debates as patterns and frameworks rather than individual independent things with all their individual independent arguments. Alright, until next week when we discuss metaphors. Goodbye.